Droughts and shortage of water are optional. That's a pretty big statement, that, isn't it? But if we look closer at these photos, I'm sure we all see similar examples, everywhere we go. And two of the biggest issues that I have when I talk to people are drought and erosion. And drought's an apparent lack of water, and erosion's too much water. So somewhere in there is opportunity. Hi everybody, my name's Glenn and I'm based in the Charleville area. However, I'm pretty fortunate I get to travel all around the countryside as part of the team, and I get to brainstorm restoration projects with awesome landholders all over the place. As landholders, it's often stepping back and identifying levels of function in our landscape, and this can give us goals on what we're trying to achieve. A fantastic photo here, National Geographic had an article there where they did a cutting. Some scientists, and they washed away the soil to give us a bit of a look at what's happening underground. And it's just such a valuable shot, this one here, to see the actual sponge that's created under perennial pastures. And when we have that amount of sponge functioning and level root development, it becomes a massive water storage that stores a lot of our rainfall. We can see right beside this image of the native pasture is some cropping, and whether it's wheat or barley, whatever it is. We can see that on those annual plants just how small a root system there is, and there just isn't that same sponge to store that water. I did a water infiltration test out in this country, and where we had that good pasture, we were looking at 3 inches infiltrating in 1.5 minutes. Some of it was even quicker than that. But right beside that, where we had our bare soils that had gone capped, we were looking at 3 inches of water still there 10 hours later. And that's just really important because that's where a lot of our flooding starts. So getting that right and getting the management right to get that ground cover back is a lot of the importance in drought mitigation and also flood mitigation. A lot of the work that we tend to do here is helping landholders identify where the landscape has lost its function, and then using an ever-increasing range of tools from the toolbox, brainstorming ideas and coming up with ways to tackle the issue. On my little research block, my latest water infiltration tests have actually shown it can absorb 10 inches of water in 10 minutes. Gets to the point, I just love storms. I'm fascinated at the challenges, just seeing how much water it can store in that huge organic sponge and under perennial grasses and deep-rooted trees. There's a fantastic story from Walter, no, I always get his name wrong, my humble apologies, Walter Jenny. And when he was working for CSIRO, he used to talk about if they could either genetically select or genetically produce a plant that gave a 30% increase in productivity. That was massive. There'd be a big office party and someone would get a plant named after them. They'd all get new lab coats and it's a pretty big deal. But 30%, you imagine a cropping situation, that 30% is all profit. And yet, if we can take a rainfall event that normally keeps the ground wet for 8 to 10 days, if we can take that same rainfall event and keep the ground wet for 100 days, that's a 1,000% increase in productivity just through longevity of green. The productivity value of that alone. And we'll look at these photos here, and those photos taken on the same day during the 2019 drought. That's after a significant rainfall period over a couple of weeks. We get a few storms come through. And only a fence and management separate those two landscapes. It's just a good example where lost landscape function has started an accumulation of runoff and creating that erosion. So the first photo is on a road reserve. There's no stock or agriculture. It's just that balance is broken. And the second photo shows a landscape only 100 metres away where agriculture and animals are being used for restoration and good management. It's also an example of where water is made to travel slowly through the landscape, reducing that impact and longevity of drought while also controlling flooding and erosion. This is low rainfall country out here, and yet in a lot of areas, what rain we are getting is doing damage. It's how do we put that water back to work? Using tools from the toolbox, a huge potential just from management. There's not always that need for mechanical intervention. It's aiming for that good ground cover to be rain ready. We're always expanding on that toolbox. There are so many land management options that we can tap into. It's a fascinating area. I find agriculture really exciting now. There's so much that we can do. Mechanical intervention, when country can no longer heal itself, where do we start? Even on a small scale, everyday properties, just our everyday management of fence lines and roads and that water that's, a lot of our drains that we put in are designed to take that water out of the landscape quickly, and it often causes damage. It's often where that erosion starts. But there are very simple ways that we can slow that water down and put it back to work. Erosion can be seen as an opportunity to water the landscape just with simple contour bank designs. This is another charlevoix landholder standing next to a totally grassed over dual-purpose contour bank, and this area was totally bare 14 months ago. It really only takes a slight change in our designs, and suddenly we can make that water we can put it back to work and restore the environmental aspect as well as the productivity aspect of the landscape, which gives us that better drought resilience as well. And often when going to properties, it's, looking at those bywashes on dams, on where they've already put in things and how can we improve on them. Sometimes where something hasn't worked, it's going upstream or deciding why it hasn't worked. Is it the water's coming down too quickly from upstream? What else can we do to modify it and get it functioning even better? The possibilities are endless. This is the 6-year-old spreader bank system that's creating extraordinary growth, and this was in the middle of a drought. 2019, this photo was taken. Not only can you barely see the motorbike that's in there, but the contour banks are completely grassed over. But just slowing that water down, putting it back to work. What we tend to do a lot out here is network with many landholders and put together all the different things that have worked for different people and then share those experiences. It's different things work in different areas. So the more ideas we get, the more that we have to share. When we're looking at a large-scale restoration, we can use similar approaches anywhere, but floodplains and wetlands are often the biggest bang for buck. Even in drought, these areas may still have an accumulated flow of water over them that may often be up to or over a metre. Floodplain ecosystems are among the most productive landscapes on Earth. In this situation here, these satellite images, it's not a real big property. This one was 33,000 hectare place. The left-hand one, the red colour is mulga lands, and it's about a third of the country there, and 2/3 of that property is floodplains and wetlands. And if you look at the second image right beside it, that's a seasonal bare ground satellite image. And the most productive areas there, those floodplains and wetlands, are nearly bare. They've just totally lost their function. We're pretty lucky out here. Many of these floodplains are so flat. They're very safe places to work. And we can get huge impact for very little cost. So that's often where we find that we're going into those areas because they get so much extra accumulated rainfall. But if we can restore their function, the environmental and the productivity value of those is enormous. Climate challenges. Living out here, we're dealing with all sorts of challenges, climate being a big one. In the middle of a drought, this is a narrow hailstorm that went through just north of Quilpie in September 2021. More and more we seem to be dealing with these extreme weather conditions and how do we buffer our landscapes against these? That's just where the hail is washed up by the water, but it just gives an indication of, you just wouldn't appreciate that you'd get that sort of an event out here in these semi-arid locations. Now, when we're looking at a landscape and looking at where is it not functioning, we can see clearly here the purple on this, pretty purple that goes across is where that hailstorm went. The purple's just the way the satellite layers colour the water, the moisture. And we can see that on this section of floodplain, the water is spread out fairly well across it until all of a sudden right here, it's dropping into an erosion point. And suddenly from here down, that floodplain has lost function. And that goes for another 60 kilometres, that floodplain, where most of it's gone into an eroded gully and not out on the floodplain. So that's the sort of area that we would go and have a look at. We would target areas like that, find what can we do to get that water back out where it used to be. This is what a lot of that country looks like on the ground. 120 years ago, 130,000 sheep used to be shorn in a shearing shed on this fragile floodplain, and this is just south of that, where that hailstorm went. And this is just examples of a lot of this country out here and what we're dealing with. That amount of stocking on incredibly fragile country, it was very productive, but it certainly couldn't handle that high density and set stocking rates. And this is the legacy that landholders now are having to deal with. And this is the sort of thing that, we're trying to help them restore. The people out here, the custodians now, the people who are on the land, are desperate to restore that functionality. They realise that same old won't cut it anymore, and what can we do to restore this country? Now, in the top right-hand inset, that's what a lot of it looks like. And it's just where we're marking out some levels to see what we can do. This bottom image here, there are still little windows of the past, little areas amongst here where it hasn't degraded to the same extent, and we can just see how productive these areas had been. This is Mitchell grass and bluebush swampy areas. So they were highly productive areas. There are so many different methods that we use, and a lot of it's dealing with what machinery people have, what's available to them, and what's economical. Money is tight, so we're just using whatever tools and equipment are available to most land managers. We have had some fantastic funding from both state and federal governments, and this has been brilliant for demonstration sites, and it's been a really good start. We're also using innovation to develop cost-effective methods, and then just tweaking these designs to suit the landscape. Once again, all different scales of operations, whether it's just a bit of a blade on the back of a Fergie tractor or using big machinery. It's just really making the most of what is available. One property I was at the other day, was 1.2 million acres. And, on places like that, sometimes you've got to resort to jumping in a chopper or a plane to get around, to get a bit of an overview. These other images here are just, the vehicles and some of the team members all kitted up to get out into remote country. Drought resilience, it's often reimagining, recreating and restoring. This is ground that was bared and eroding for many years. The top right-hand image, that had actually been locked up for 7 years and hadn't improved at all until we actually got in and did a little bit of mechanical work. First storms, in a matter of months, we had feed growing. And some country, you've actually got to get water off. It's so degraded that any water it is getting is just causing more damage. Sometimes you've got to remove that water and just let country or give country a chance to come back just with the rainfall. Just add water. This is just another area where 21 millimetres storm in January 21 on over 20 kilometres spreader banks. You can just see these very low profile banks scattered through here. And normally this sort of rainfall on here, on a lot of what is just claypan country, would have disappeared down erosion features in 15 minutes. And now this water takes many hours to make its way through those spreader banks. In fact, normally he'd drive around straight away after rainfall like that, but here the next day it was too wet, he couldn't get through it. And, what that does, that amount of moisture back into that landscape, what that does for your productivity, both environmentally and agricultural-wise, that it's just that sudden twist in the key that just takes it from completely non-productive to productivity. It's an amazingly simple operation sometimes. This is just a simple bank that just shifted water out off an overflow off a dam. It took it out a couple of kilometres before the first opening, and a lot of the water went down the top side, but then let some water come back on the bottom side. But just a before and after, straight away, very, very quickly. This country here wasn't as, bare. It obviously had growth on it, but once you get further away, it's just back to clay pans. But it was getting that water back out to where it was needed, but not denying it from all of the country below it. That landholder actually, he found those designs so successful that he actually went out and bought more country. You could see an answer to restore it. Intervention sites, where to start? In this case here, this red country at the side, this is just mould country. All this other country here is floodplain areas where, we can actually see a lot from satellite image. We do that a lot. We use a lot of satellite imagery in what we're doing, and we can often see where problem points are. where the dark colouring is here, that is where there's some productivity in the soil. There's carbon, there's moisture in it. And where it's really pale, that's where it's gone back to clay pan. In this case here, there's bore drains. They've been a big problem through a lot of this area, abandoned bore drains that used to carry the artesian water. And in this case, there's one travelling down here and it goes through this section here and then into the next one and then keeps going down through here. Now, they don't seem bad. They don't seem like much when you look at them. But when you've got small volumes of water coming through, they're enough to drain these areas before they get a chance to fill. What that actually looks like, this is that bore drain at the bottom of one of those little wetland areas. That's the bore drain going through here. And this is where we've just put a bit of a timber windrow across it to try and slow that water going through, slow the passage of water and make sure that the water has time to fill these wetlands behind it. So that's all that we did. And suddenly those wetlands look like this. Landholder never seen it. A lot of that's 5 and 6 foot high is draining slowly. It just suddenly gives those wetlands a chance to fill completely. The bird life and wildlife you get coming back into these, sometimes you go past these and it's deafening, once they've got water back in them and they're draining slowly. The incredible amount of fauna and flora is brought back into those areas. That's these two areas here. Now, one's 150 hectares, one's 110 hectares. That same bore drain runs down here and then drains through here. This is 2,500 hectares here. It's all incredibly flat as well. It drains through a bore drain there and another bore drain over here. We have actually since done work on that. That was last October. We've done a lot of work through here now. We've gone back and these were the initial government-funded project sites, and the landholder was so inspired he's gone and invested a lot of money himself and going through this whole area trying to restore it. Unfortunately, as often happens out here, these were done in October last year and we haven't had any rain since. So, we're still waiting to see what's going to happen. There's 140 kilometres just down this one drainage system here of floodplains. There's no major creek system. But it's still a drainage area from a lot of country. It's actually become a real community project where everyone's getting involved. And we're actually finding, your first thought is if someone's slowing water upstream, is that going to deny someone downstream? But it's actually the reverse. We're finding people downstream are offering to pay to get work done upstream so that water's slowed before it gets to them and it's safer for them to try and slow it and restore function. You get phone calls from landholders after rain events and, just so excited. And I find my phone gets flooded by those phone calls and videos of all these works and how it's all going. This is one video a bloke said here.
I'm going to stick up my, put this finger where the mark is. That's how deep water is on the other side. And on this side, you can see the ground might be 1-2 inches deep here. So it's holding up probably at least 6 inches of water. So that's 6 inches pushing out, ready.
What that looks like from the air, he got a chopper in after that to have a look at it. He's put in a number of these banks there now on this one system. And in the past, it was a matter of, you'd get most rainfall events and the water would just travel down stock pads, roads or fences or some little erosion thing in the middle. Most of the flats miss out on any water, unless you get a really big storm event. In this case here, now every small rain event is a big rain event. It covers the whole flats every time. And instead of the water all going through in a matter of hours, it now takes days for that water to go through. To the point, there's a lady that lives downstream from here, and before we did this work, she had there was a big rain event, and she lives on the bank of where a number of these flats come together into one creek system. Anyway, this rain event, it sent down a fairly big flood, and all the neighbours got together and had to help her sandbag the house and shift all of the gear out of the sheds. Anyway, we did this work, and anyway, another big rain event, and she rang up the landholder above her and said, how much rain's coming down, how much water's coming down? Do I have to shift everything again? And he said, well, look, there's an awful lot of water coming down, but it's not going to hit you all in one big peak. It's going to take probably a week to come through. It's just going to come through gently. Well, she called me early this year and said, the water now, for the first time ever, she's having a lot of those runs are coming through, the water's clear, which is just extraordinary for out here. You wouldn't imagine it possible. You grow up out here and it's just always muddy, soupy water. But there's just so much grass there now, so much of that sediment's being kept on those floodplains. People are getting out now. They're more aware of where there are issues and what to look for. They can see that these are erosion features and are trying to address them. Before?
We're small. It's getting water dried out before it can fill.
So that was a critical thing. It's the water's getting drained out before it can fill. And, what that looks like from the air, this is where he was standing just down here, where he took that video, and the erosion only just started there. It gets nasty fairly quickly. But by getting in at that point, this looks like a big works. There's a long earth bank and then there's a timber bank along here that lets the water trickle back through into all of this country. It hasn't stopped it, but had to do something a little bit aggressive across that, the erosion. But the incredible thing here is the amount of water that we were just looking at travelling down that little eroded gully. When that was slowed down and given the chance to spread sideways, that's the amount of floodplain that was able to flood again. Previously, all of that, where all this water is outside here, just wasn't getting water anymore. When we looked at the cost of this, we said, righto, well, this is probably going to cost around $4,000, maybe $6,000 at the most to do. How many head might that take how many head of cattle might need to, we're only looking at this spot out here. If we just send some water back out to here, and there's a lot of country keeps going out there that got water sent back over it. But how many head of cattle could that defatten to cover the cost of repairing it? So really it wasn't a lot. The actual productivity, the scale of the productivity, there's another wetland over further, the first one he did, and it got to the point it was only filling once every 10 years and in a really big rain event. Its problem was the water wasn't getting to it. There was an erosion feature stopping the water at the head of it, and we just redirected it back where it used to go. And we've gone from getting a flood once every 10 years to 18 times that's had water flood into it in 2 years. On the very first flood that it had into it meant that 3,000 sheep and a couple of hundred head of weaners that he was about to send off on agistment during the drought, he suddenly had somewhere to put them. Now, ideally, I'd love to be able to spell it straight away and take the pressure off that country. But what that's meant to him, it's all part of huge paddocks, and the cost of fencing is massive. But restoring these high value areas in these big paddocks has taken so much grazing pressure off the bigger paddocks that the rest of the country is getting de-stocked and coming away. And they're getting grassed up and there's less runoff. The water generally is slowing down within the whole landscape. The area of benefit is quite massive. It's to the point, though, that the $100,000 that he was budgeting on every year for drought feed, and that was buying hay and cottonseed, he's now putting that $100,000 into restoration work and fixing erosion, and that is now his drought mitigation. It's a completely new way of looking at it, and the work isn't just about production benefits. There is an incredible opportunity for the go benefits of future potential natural capital values, which at this stage it hasn't been quantified. And for a large part of our current playgrounds in southwest Queensland, we're restoring wetlands and rangelands that are of such scale that we see major introduction of native fauna and flora. We see big benefits interconnecting these wetlands across the region with the Currawunya Ramsar wetlands. You look at soil carbon, most of the time they say that you can't do soil carbon projects in country that's under 600 millimetre rainfall or if it's not high quality soils. Just in 1 to 2 years, we were able to test soils. We did some soil carbon testing, and because we could test inside an area of influence and then 30 or 40 metres away, it's exactly the same soil where we hadn't impacted it, we could test what the soil was like there just under its, the way it had been working. You can see that we're coming from incredibly low levels of soil carbon, some of it was less than 0.2 total soil carbon, jumping incredibly quickly just in that 1 to 2 years. Some of the sites actually went up to close to around a 3% soil carbon. We don't know where all of that could lead yet. The other thing to bear in mind, though, is talk of 600 millimetre rainfall, country that has to be that higher rainfall to go into soil carbon. A lot of these wetlands might have an accumulated water over them, might be measured in metres. So, and some of them are huge, huge scale. I was looking at one the other day that was, one dead-end wetland alone. It was just a flood-out area. It was 230,000 acres. There are huge wetlands out here. Look, very quickly, one other, just in case there are people that have this other, different sort of country. I was at a place a month or so ago, and a lot of hard country, but just had this beautiful snapshot of what the country looked like pre-European. There were just little sections that were still working incredibly well. And these billabongs, these last rain had been in November last year, yet where this was working, these little billabongs along this flat system were totally surrounded by what he was calling a blady grass. You had to sort of fight your way through it a lot of time to try and see where the billabongs were. But the water table was obviously so much higher in these areas that even though it was only a month ago we were there, all the grass on the flats in between these billabongs still had a green tinge. There was still water on the surface. There was little soaks, and just incredibly healthy. And the bird life and the fish and yabbies and everything living in these water holes was quite amazing. And yet, just below these areas, we could see where there was too much water starting to travel down these flats. And we see it everywhere. But, we went from somewhere so incredibly healthy to this in such a short distance. And it got to the point where, and it's just from too much water starting to come down these flats, too much water coming down from the headwaters and too fast. And these grassy flats, even though they are grass, just couldn't handle that level of water coming through. And we see it everywhere. But it gets to the point then that these erosion features chew out the end of the billabongs, and until it gets to the point where a little bit further down, it's just all like this. All the soil is gone. It's fairly shallow soil country, this, and it's just down to top rock. And, it's what do we do? How do we recover from that? It's acknowledging that process, but it's also then trying to find solutions. This was just on one flat. So many of the other flats that he had on the place are just basically, eroded gullies like this. And now that's the thing now. So many landholders that are out here are wanting to do something. They see what's gone wrong in the past and they're desperate to try and make changes. So what are we doing in this situation here? Drought and flood resilience planning. How can we restore the chains of billabongs and productive flats? In this case, the first step was to slow the velocity of water coming down from the headwaters. We used some thick understory that was starting to choke out the bigger trees on some of the smaller tributaries, and using them to make little timber windrows to slow the water down so that not all the water's coming down in one big bush. Further down, we're pulling some water off and spread it into spreader channels and taking it out into safe zones where the water could filter back down. Once these spreader channels were full, they overflow evenly the whole way along, and then they trickle back through the grass and back down into the flats. So you can suddenly make the flat systems several kilometres wide instead of being 30 or 40 metres wide. In other places, we were starting to build up the ends of the billabongs again and putting pipes in for them to overflow out of once they were full. These slides are more just to try and show the scale of some of the restoration work, incredible work that a lot of landholders are doing out here. Last slide, it's from another regenerative agriculture group, but it's just a fantastic slide. People can make rain. We can cool down the planet, rehydrate the land and turn deserts green. It just starts with imagination. But anyway, that was my slide. Thanks, everybody.